Welcome everyone in. Well, guys, thank you so much for joining. It's a pleasure to have you all here. This is the second talk of the expert stage / channel / whatever we'd like to call it of the Hack From Home against COVID-19. It's been a very exciting weekend so far. We've had a host of really interesting professors and speakers and ethics experts and entrepreneurs and designers on this stage alone. And today we've been carrying on with firstly, a talk from one of our collaborators and sponsors, Thomas Ladrain of Just One Giant Lab, who spoke earlier. We now have Dr. Rasvan Nicolescu, an anthropologist, and Oliver Harvey, an economist, coming to talk to us about the social, economic, and technological tensions unleashed by this time of pandemic, which, you know, particularly for those of you who are thinking about applications in that third stream of the hackathon, i.e. the care and the community application, will be particularly useful as inputs into what you're thinking of. After this talk, we'll be having a pitch doctor session with one of our senior team members talking about how to construct a really good pitch for later tonight. There'll be a few more lectures on this expert channel, and then some more pitching, a chance for you guys to pitch to one another, and then, of course, that all-important 23:59 submission deadline, so that the judges who will be making their determinations over the week can think about it. Following that, there will, of course, be some drinks, albeit remotely. So without any further ado, and having plugged the rest of the schedule at great, I'd like to begin the conversation. So obviously, you know, this is a panel, and there's a whole range of things we can talk about. I think from our side, you know, when we constructed the agenda for this hackathon, we were sort of struck by two particular things. There's an urgent response, and then there's the lingering impacts of what's taking place over these months. In terms of the urgent response, you know, we've seen the emphasis on immediately shutting everyone down. But what we haven't talked so much is the consequence of shutting everyone down. And I wondered perhaps if the pair of you would like to speak to that. Razvan, if you would like to speak initially, perhaps on your views. I know you've been participating in the hackathon as an observer as well over the last day. Well, drifting in and out, it'd be very interesting to hear your reflections in general upon, you know, how humans will adapt over this particular period.
Okay, now good. It works, yeah. Great, thanks. Unfortunately, I couldn't contribute too much yesterday, and probably later today I won't be able as well because of personal issues. Anyway, as you put it, and we talked yesterday, really for us anthropologists, things are so general now that we cannot really have an opinion. But what we can is just, you know, bring some sort of expertise from our own understanding of societies and culture and how this virus maybe works, and have some sort of early observations that can kind of, you know, maybe inform the design phase of it rather than other things. And of course, I'd be really very happy to answer to, you know, more focused kind of questions. So I would start with the famous curve that we keep seeing, you know, in the United Kingdom, at least with, you know, that scientific kind of thing, you know, that, you know, we are in the front of a pandemic, and, you know, this is how a pandemic looks like, and the response of our society is kind of, you know, shaping that curve, you know, and as far as we know, until now, you know, we are in this kind of stage where we are supposed to delay the peak and then flatten the peak, right? You know, then government is doing all sorts of things in terms of, you know, putting pressure on us as individuals to kind of, you know, respect the guidelines and, you know, do our best to kind of, you know, follow those two objectives. And I think this is pretty fair, and we are just trying to do it. However, we as anthropologists, we have at least two issues, or two set of issues with this kind of approach. First, I would argue that in a way it's too scientific. too scientific and in a way too universalizing or generalizing. And we can see that as if we are moving down in the society and we are looking at different communities and especially if we are looking at issues such as poverty and access to food and medicine and if we are looking at homeless people, for example, kind of thing. So in a way, we anthropologists we come to look at the stories beyond that curve, So that curve is made out of numbers, right? But we are talking with real people that at a higher level, they aggregate themselves into those kind of numbers. So in a way, that kind of puts me in a position to kind of be more sympathetic to very local kind of initiatives that to my mind would actually help saving lives maybe and making things better as we are moving toward the peak, but also respect the government's kind of and observe the government's guidelines. And I'm talking about local support, mutual aid groups kind of thing, which at least in London and talking with different students and staff in UCL, at least I can see how this work and how big effect that can have on more vulnerable people, right? And we can have a separate discussion on that. And the second point regarding this curve is that this is just one curve out of so many, and probably you all know so well about this. But in a way, there are very important cultural and social implications of communicating just one curve, I'm not talking about people being or becoming obsessed with the virus and the terminology and syntax around it and so on and so forth, but also I'm talking about different segments of our societies in a way doing all their best to try to not ignore all the other curves that happen in our lives, right? And I'm talking about anything really, from education to personal relationships to health, healthcare. For example, I'm in a situation where I live with people that are vulnerable in my household, and they have their own curves in terms of seeing their GPs and being prescribed, and everything got postponed in different ways. So we should just be aware that if at the macro level of societies things seem to be normal, and in terms of being being educated by science, at least at the micro level of societies, people have all sorts of other kind of issues and other problems that sometimes they really struggle to fit into the bigger narrative that the government is presenting us. So therefore, again, in terms of hackathon, I would really be very sympathetic, and I would like to contribute as much as possible to the kind of projects that look at communities and look at how people are getting on with their own lives on an everyday basis, and so on and so forth.
Do you think,
I don't know if
Rasvan,
I still have time for other thoughts, or I can come back later.
Yes, well, I was just going to say, there's some interesting things there. I mean, one thing, I suppose, as an anthropologist, that I want to ask you is, can you see this changing what it means to be in a community, which has been for so long a physical ideal, but if people are, for instance, interacting as we are now, we had our Zoom pub session last night. Is there some cultural implications there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, the general idea is that, this is an interval. I mean, looking at anthropological literature kind of thing, and I can look at this pandemic as a sort of interval, right? In our own lives, an interval that represents some sort of opportunity, right? So the kind of opportunity this hackathon maybe is trying to exploit in a good sense, right? So and in this interval, in a way, is also opportunity for us at a more individual level to kind of reflect on what we have done wrong or we have done good, and what we can make from now on. And for sure, communities are one very important aspect where we can reflect, because now suddenly we are inundated with all these communities that we weren't aware of. For example,
digital communities.
Yeah, exactly. Like I have a street WhatsApp group, yeah, and neighbors that didn't know each other's names for years, or maybe now they're just friends, and they buy meat each other, and they and they announce where they go to the pharmacy, and and there is some good literature showing that in London particularly, where people used to change houses every 5 years or so in average, and where only 1 in 5, I think, people know their
neighbors.
Names, exactly, the names of the next door neighbors, and all these kind of things. Now this is changed. It's completely changed. And my question now as anthropologist is whether we would go back to the previous situation, or actually this pandemic, we will in a way give thanks to this pandemic, because in a way it united us and made us more realize how important it is to be closer to each other and to do things to each other.
That's a really interesting point.
And what's more than that is that in a way it goes back to the curve I was talking initially, because in a way we keep hearing that, oh, when we go back to normal, oh, when everything will be finished, we'll start with our normal lives. So as if what was before the pandemic was the normal, but are we really happy to go back to that normal, in the sense that we now just realize that, for example, you, James, can be my friend, would I just be happy to forget about you then? Because, normally I don't know you, before the pandemic, I didn't know you. So is there such thing as a normal thing, where in anthropological terms, we would say that no, things are not normal, we all live very abnormal lives, and
always contingent cultural patterns awaiting further change.
So that's why, in a way, I'm worried about this meta discourse just taking the scene in a way, and trying to generalize and stereotypize.
Interesting.
And so forth. Of course, for medical reasons.
Now, Rasvan, I'll have to pause you there, because you've raised a couple of very interesting points. A couple of which I'd like Mr. Harvey to speak to. So, I mean, you've raised this idea that actually, firstly, all societies are constantly in a state of flux, and we're never going to quite back to the norm. And I think that's a really interesting thing to have flagged. The second is, your point on how, at least in certain urban areas like London, this might actually facilitate community ties and community bonds. I mean, I can affirm I now know the names of all sorts of people in my block who I never would have done through WhatsApp. But, so on one hand, there's this digital connectivity. It's kind of digitally enabled, but also quite localized, which is a kind of interesting apparent dichotomy there. But at the same time, there's going to be a lot of pressures. Oliver, I know through your work that you're quite concerned about some of the social implications of the changes that are going to happen. And I sort of wonder what your views might be on, in the years and months ahead, whether or not we will be having, so much social connection as, I guess, a lot of economic pressures begin to bite in society.
Well, James, I think you're right that there's a sort of short-term economic consequence, and then there's a longer term economic consequence. And I think at the moment we know much more about the short term economic consequences. I mean, the simple answer is it will be very difficult. If you look at some of the jobless numbers from the US that came out last week, for example, it was the largest rise in jobless numbers in the history of that data series. In fact, in a way, you would almost have had to have made that chart of jobless claims in the US a log scale, much like the unfortunate death charts are, to sort of be able to gauge quite how bad the shock will be. But I think the focus has got to be on the long-term consequences, and in particular how quickly the economy can recover. And I think what policy has to do, and hopefully what people in the hackathon might think about, is what ways, what things they can be doing to ensure that when the lockdowns begin to ease, the economy can recover as fast as possible. And I think there are two really important things to that. The first one I've already mentioned is unemployment. So we've had a lot of these schemes being announced in Europe and also in the UK and in the US, which is designed to try to keep people, even if they're not working, from actually losing their jobs. And that's really important because when somebody becomes unemployed, they lose skills, they're particularly long-term unemployed, they lose skills, they can lose a bit of hope rather, and effectively become disconnected from the labour force. And that can be very damaging. And the other one, I think, which is really important is keeping companies afloat, because a lot of companies that had been very profitable, there was nothing wrong with them, have suddenly been struck by this virus or struck by these lockdowns. So I think the two really important things from an economic perspective, I think the most important thing from an economic perspective is this idea that the economy can recover as fast as possible without, with as little as possible long-term damage being done. And I think two really important things there is one, this idea of labour markets and keeping people active, keeping people occupied, keeping people on the payroll. And the second one is ensuring that companies remain afloat, even if they're not actually doing anything for the time being. So in economic parlance, we'd call this trying to keep the supply side of the economy as least damaged as possible. So perhaps those are two things that the hackathon can think about.
In terms of the phenomenon of remote work, we have this notion of people obviously wanting jobs, supply to be maintained. Also, I guess that sense of hope you referred to earlier. I'm aware of there being in the anthropological literature, there's obviously been a lot of research on remote work recently. I dare say there'll be a lot more. I wonder, as from an economic, more of an economist perspective, what, if any, research you've encountered upon remote work and how that's kind of interacting? Is it seen as being particularly efficient? Is it seen as being a way that people can train in a useful way? Can people continue to reskill? Because there's all this sort of hope for that, and there's the belief that, as Rasvan was saying, that communities can be generated well, they already are, but strong, stable communities. And I wonder if there's belief in the economics profession, if that also maps as of yet fully onto the workplace.
Well, I think it's very interesting you say that, because before the coronavirus hit, there had been quite a few economists writing about the possibility that we could shift towards more flexible working arrangements, maybe that the working week could be cut without losses in productivity or losses in efficiency. It was just compressing what work you were doing into a smaller period of time. And also, given the increased knowledge and understanding about things like maternity and paternity leave and people's mental health, I think there has been over time a greater interest in the possibility of flexible working arrangements. So perhaps that provides some ray of light or hope, insofar as this is probably a very good natural experiment to understand how well those flexible working arrangements can operate. I mean, I think there are, however, certain jobs in which it clearly is impossible to work from home. If you are working in retail, or if you are working in the hospitality industry, those are jobs that are clearly rely on interpersonal skills and rely on human connection. So I think that yes, this is certainly an interesting experiment to see if many office jobs, if you like, if we can move towards a more flexible way of working, and how that goes, and what the efficiencies are. I think also we've got to remember that not every job is going to be online. You can't run a Zoom restaurant, unfortunately, and that's why I said I think
you never know. You never know. You can give it a go.
We can try. Certainly not if it's my cooking. But I think what's really important is ensuring that those workers in those industries, such as retail, such as hospitality, that have effectively been shut down, have jobs to go back to when the lockdowns are lifted.
Rasvan, I know you made contributions to work called Digital Ethnography, which sadly is, which I did indeed buy, but sadly is on my desk in my lockdown office, so I can't get to it. I was wondering, maybe from that work, or generally from your research, what people can do to create durable communities when they're never actually going to see one another. I mean, there's been obviously online communities of sorts for, well, as long as the internet happens, but it seems to me as though there's now so much more being asked of these communities, to be like the sort of the central locus for all of your work. All of the kind of social dynamics that would ordinarily be incredibly key for the workplace are now lost. You can't see someone's body language so well. One sees now of Zoom dates. I have some friends who've been going on these recently. How can that? What can leaders of organizations do to try and create that sense of community, that which the physicality has always been the focus for?
Well, I strongly believe that community cannot exist if you don't have that element of human interaction, an in-person kind of thing. In all my work and the kind of anthropologists I work with, like Danny Miller and his teams and so on, we are always arguing that actually the success or failure of an online community is very much related to the kind of, to the degree of offline interactions in those particular communities. Maybe things will start to change now. We don't know. We don't make these kind of predictions, but to be honest, I would find it really very difficult. So I would see as a sort of, temporary kind of adjustments to the existing communities, and maybe new communities being formed. But again, the WhatsApp community that is newly formed on my street is so successful because people are actually doing services for each other, even if they don't look in their eyes. They just drop the eggs or the milk, the bottle of milk on the doorstep, and then they just send the message and then take it. So actually there is some sort of physical human implication in that community. And we would see that those people who wouldn't be able to, contribute physically to communities unless they are unwell or they are vulnerable, and so therefore other people have to do services for them, in a way they would be excluded from those communities. But again, things can change, especially if we are in a process kind of thing, because again, we as anthropologists, we believe that, again, criticizing the norm and criticizing those kind of things, we can see actually that we are in process, right? So all our kind of, actions in this world are, are in a way depend on the context where we act, on the predispositions that we have, the habitus we're habituated into, and so on and so forth. So all this kind of, settings. So actually, it's really very difficult to, to feed online communities with those elements, simply by online means, which doesn't mean that, if the virus won't just pass, and if we'll come back probably November or maybe in 2 years from now, then probably those communities would have, those online communities would have some sort of, life expectancy that is greater than that interval I'm talking about. So
we've had Rasvan a question which I think would be interesting to both of you, but I think particularly to you, Rasvan, which is someone has written in that I guess it's a sort of statement question, which is that he's worried that systems from Kostas, the systems will be rushed in place now and then stay in place due to the inertia of larger healthcare systems. Now, I guess this questioner then mentions social distancing, but I sort of wonder, we've seen in states all around the world this rush towards repressive measures, of obviously a heavy emphasis on digital surveillance. As an anthropologist, you mentioned this term habitus, which obviously is a particular anthropological term used in particular ways, but could you see people becoming highly habituated to these kind of systems of digital monitoring and control, such that actually, we never quite go back to where we were before? People just get used to having the government or healthcare providers always monitoring how well they're breathing and stopping them from going into particular public spaces. Could you see a risk of that happening?
Yeah, there are risks, but again, it depends on society and culture and habitus, right? So I'm talking with people from students from China and one colleague from China, and and in their own personal experiences and one ethnographic research, they argue that actually, many people in places like in Southeast Asia really don't see any issue, any important issue with this kind of monitoring, social monitoring. Actually, they understand this is for their own benefit. And even now with this pandemic, it's so interesting because they reflect back on what happens in the UK, and they are very critical about what happens in the UK. For example, one story is that, their own families in China, when they heard that, there is this virus going on in some neighboring city, they might just opt to self-isolate themselves, even if they don't have any symptoms, So therefore, they're just very surprised that, in UK, they can see people jogging around in neighborhoods where we know for sure that there are thousands of people infected, So again, this is the cultural kind of, difference that is important and meaningful in this discussion. And we can have a very similar parallel with the mask, the wearing of the mask kind of thing, but maybe later, because in a way it's the same lesson we can learn from that, So in a way you are talking about, or the question is talking about healthcare systems and everything, where I agree that in a way research should be led by science, and it should be led by people who really know what they are talking about, by medics, by people that, in a way do that from—
Trust the experts, in other words.
Whereas, I'm really worried about, new technologies just jumping now and saying that, oh, we all have a say, we also have a say here, or because indeed, it's just not too much time for testing those new technologies. We are, for actually looking at the social consequences of new technologies. So as far as they don't don't impact vital segments of our societies, they are welcome. But if they just deal with very sensitive information or data like patient data and so on and so forth, then I would be very worried about new technologies.
Now I'm mindful of the time, as we now have a few minutes coming up for the next one. Guys, if you have any questions, please do ping them in. We can take one question. If not, I'd recommend popping into the Ask Me Anything channel on Slack, and we can discuss those there. It certainly seems to me as though some really interesting things have been raised about our capacity to get used to things, and the kind of pressures that are going to be put on society through government responses. I was very interested by this kind of notion of we have this narrative of everything being global, but actually the local being really re-emphasized. And I think that's an interesting paradox we have here. On one hand, we have these global communities such as this one over this weekend collaborating. On the other hand, we have apparently the nation state returning, as put by some of our earlier speakers yesterday, the primacy of the nation state, with one speaker suggesting the future crumbling of the European Union around that. So it's an interesting paradoxical time. Ideas flowing perhaps, but resources becoming more local. Now on that note, I think guys, I'm going to call the end of this talk. It's been a really interesting contribution from you both. I urge you, if you have time, to hang around in Slack, pop on the Ask Me Anything channel and let people ping questions to you, and of course also to appear and join in the remaining chats on the expert stage. For all those of you who are listening in, the next talk coming up in 14 minutes is from a partner in Dawn Capital, not Dawn Capital, very much not Dawn Capital, IQ Capital, who will be talking about what makes a world-changing idea, which is obviously particularly relevant for people who are wanting to put together their proposals in advance of the rest of the day. We then have a further schedule mixing expert talks and then pitch doctor sessions to help you make the most of your pitches. And yeah, that's about it from me from now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to direct message me. It's James Kingston, or throw them into the general channel on Slack. Thank you very much, Oliver and Rasvan. It's been a pleasure listening to you. Really interesting points raised to you both. And goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.